Okay, so what are the important issues for us? The stability of culture, or of cultural communities. Does anything similar to a cultural DNA exist? Is there a gene for Canadian culture, for Spanish culture, or for whatever? Something that you can identify and see that it's not going to change over time, so you can point out and say, okay, we are the same again. The second problem is the role played by cultural units, if they exist. Are there memes or not? And if they are they discrete or continuous? That's a second important problem. In any model and in any approach that you use or try to work with, you have to be very clear about what kind of game of culture you are trying to model, because there are many different things that we call culture. We have Paul Higgs from McMaster University, who's an astrophysicist, has a very interesting article about mimetic transitions and evolution related to the size of the brain and several things. But mimesis is only one of the games of culture. Not the only one. In that respect, Bernara and Page from the Michigan Complex Systems Center have been able to model some cases in which there are multiple games of culture and any human agent is able to play them in reasonable ways, but always under suboptimal conditions. None of the games is played at optimal conditions. Also, Scott Page just published a book called The Difference, in which he studied diversity and how and when diversity works in different social groups. And of course you have the typical discussions about horizontal social learning on the same level of your generation, and vertical or intergenerational learning and cultural transmission. We're also interested in some of the things that Tammy mentioned. How do you go from the individual actor in a cultural system, either a creator or a spectator who receives information or some interaction with a cultural object, to cultural institutions, how they get formed, either a library, a museum, a community practice, and from that to the whole level of the population, so that you can talk about Canadian culture or whatever. And in this respect, how do cultures get formed? That's where my question this morning came from. You don't have the system yet. What is it that you have? What's going on there? This is especially important, we will see later, in the case of the Hispanic Baroque, when you have an immigration or imposition of a culture on top of other layers of the culture, as the indigenous cultures in Latin America. Do culture change? And if so, how? Important also is that cultural reproduction is proteic, from proteus, according to Cavalli's foresight. And sometimes it's highly conservative, transmission, nothing happens, and other times extremely fast, like in rumors, in facts, in all those kinds of phenomena that we see everywhere. And the other important thing is that what are normally called mutations in genetics, Cavalli's foresight called innovations, so cultural mutations. And finally, about cultural areas. We're interested in how a cultural area can be defined. Not as much as a country or a specific linguistic community. What are the barriers and facilitators? And in terms of the Hispanic Baroque project, how does the migration and adaptation of Baroque patterns happen? And especially how those happen in different ecosystems, with different geographic and cultural models. How does happen the formation of a new cultural layer or area? And how can we measure the gradient of Baroquization among different cultural sub-areas, if any of these happen at all. So the other important thing in terms of clarification at the beginning is how we will not define, but try to go around the problem of what is cultural information and whether or not cultural information is a repetition of something. Any information is cultural as long as a human being is involved or not. Well, it's necessary for human adaptation. So that sadly has made culture important for the important sciences. That's why they are studying it. Not because there are human involved, but because evolution is involved. But anyway, transmission of cultural information does not follow rules of exact replication. This is the argument by Scott Outram and many others. It's difficult to copy something exactly the same way, even if you try. Another important aspect for us is that cultural information requires external storage, and I think that's basic. But it's also internalized, so the user, the human agent, is important. Any information, according to the mathematical theory of Jare, is about something, so the content is important. We cannot go around only talking about shaping, measure of complexity, or any only computational amount of information as something which is relevant in cultural terms. And in terms of knowledge management and organization of cultures, information affects learning and it is transformed into knowledge at some point. Or that's an important thing according to Nonaka and Takeruchi and their theory of knowledge management.